Hi, welcome everyone. My name is Anita Reganathan, and I'm a senior producer of cultural and special events at Toronto Public Library. Thank you for joining us for this conversation celebrating the life and work of Italian Marxist historian, philosopher, and politician Domenico Losurdo. We start all of our events with the important reminder that the City of Toronto, including all 100 branches of Toronto Public Library, are situated on Indigenous land and Dish with One Spoon territory. This is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Wendat, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. Toronto Public Library gratefully acknowledges these Indigenous nations for their guardianship of this land. Since the most recent blockade and siege on Gaza, I cannot, in good conscience, read a land acknowledgement without acknowledging the ongoing settler colonial violence both in Palestine and here in Canada. In Gaza, it is now estimated that 1 out of every 200 people have been killed. As the death toll climbs over 11,000, the Canadian government and elites stand firmly on the wrong side of history. This past Sunday, I marched with tens of thousands of people in Toronto calling for a ceasefire and an end to the killing. The contradictions are rife, and revolutionary fervor is in the air. As Iskra Books noted on social media, it is during dark and dangerous times like these where the work of someone like Domenico Losurdo is the fuel we need to keep going. I want to thank my partner Ivan Stojkovic for introducing me to Losurdo, and again, thank you all for being here. A couple of very quick housekeeping items before we get started. The chat box is located to the right of your screen. You're very active in there, and I encourage you to share your thoughts and connect with each other. However, if you have a question for our guests today, please be sure to enter it into the Ask a Question box, which is also to the right of your screen underneath the chat icon. It's easier for us to keep track of questions entered there, and it also allows you to upvote other questions. And if you look down to the bottom of your screen, there's a green button that says Order a Copy of Stalin, History and Critique of a Black Legend. That will take you to Iskra Books, where you can either purchase a copy or download a free PDF. Toronto Public Library also has 4 copies available to check out. Moving up to the top of your screen, you will see a TPL logo in a blue circle. By clicking follow, you can keep up to date with all of our excellent virtual programming and receive notifications every time we add a new event or as an event is about to go live. For example, on December 4th, Toronto Star Books editor and author of On Class, Deborah Dundas, will be in conversation with author of Made and the newly released memoir Class, Stephanie Land, right here on Crowdcast. I'll put these links in the chat in a minute. And if you'd like to join us in person, the next day on December 5th, Professors Norman Finkelstein and Christian Parenti will discuss the current state of academic freedom in conversation with former broadcast journalist Jean Maguire at the Appel Swan, and that is in person in Toronto. And now let's welcome the host and panel for today's event. Our host is Henry Hakamaki. Henry is an activist and political communicator who is primarily known for co-hosting the Guerrilla History podcast and is co-translator and editor of the new authorized English edition of Domenico Losurdo's Stalin. He can be followed on Twitter at Huck1995. Hi, Henry.
Hello, Anita. It's nice to be here.
Thank you so much for hosting.
Of course, it's my pleasure.
Awesome. And we have an extraordinary lineup of panelists today, starting with Salvatore Engel Di Mauro. Salvatore is professor and chair of Geography and Environmental Studies Department at SUNY New Paltz and senior editor for Capitalism, Nature, Socialism, and Human Geography journals. His research areas include soil contamination, urban agriculture, dialectical materialism, and socialism and environment. Socialist States and Environment is among his latest books. Salvatore up. Hello.
Hello, fantastic. Thank you very much for inviting me. Thanks very much, Henry. Thanks also for showing the book. It's very kind of you.
And next up is Gabriel Rockhill. Gabriel is a philosopher, cultural critic, and activist. He's the founding director of the Critical Theory Workshop and professor of philosophy at Villanova University. He has published 9 books, as well as numerous scholarly and journalistic articles. For more information, you can visit gabrielrockhill.com.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here. Looking forward to it.
And next, let's welcome Jennifer Ponce de Leon. Jennifer is Associate Professor of English at the University of Pennsylvania. She's the author of Another Aesthetics is Possible, Arts of Rebellion in the Fourth World War from Duke University Press. Her other publications include the co-authored introduction to the English translation of Domenico Losurdo's Western Marxism, I cannot wait, forthcoming from Monthly Review Press.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for being here. And last but certainly not least, we're very happy to welcome Roderick Day to the panel. Roderick is editor-in-chief of redsales.org, a free access collection of communist works ranging from select classics to original Marxist theory and translations. He gained acclaim for his work on Bolivia, China, fascism, and his opposition to brainwashing, much of it inspired by Losurdo. In his non-spare time, he works as a software developer. Hey.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Okay, and that's your panel. What an incredible lineup. I'm going to get out of here so that you can listen to this fantastic conversation and hand it over to Henry.
Thank you, Anita. And I do want to open by expressing my appreciation for Anita and the Toronto Public Library for hosting this discussion and for inviting us to be the panel for the discussion. Really was brave of the Toronto Public Library and Anita in particular to organize this event with this panel on these topics. And so all of the credit goes to her for making it possible. And I also want to thank my panelists that we have before us for their work on Losurdo as well as beyond Losurdo. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. And lastly, I would like to thank Iskra Books, the publisher of our new edition of Stalin, History and Critique of a Black Legend. So I'm going to open the conversation today by introducing why we're here. So I think the impetus for convening this panel is really twofold. Of course, Losurdo is always relevant and should always be relevant and always will be relevant. But in addition to the recent release of the Stalin book, there's also a forthcoming release of Western Marxism, which we'll be talking about a little bit later. But the Stalin book in particular is an interesting story. And just briefly, we talked about how we need to have this exchange of ideas. And I know that one of the future events is featuring Professors Finkelstein and Parenti about freedom of expression within the academy. This book was actually subject to something similar insofar as there was a publisher, and I'll just say Verso Books, who's published several works of Losurdo's, who outright has denied for several years to publish the Stalin book, to the point where we decided that we would just do it ourselves, Salvatore and myself. And Iskra, and again, thanks to Iskra, not only agreed to publish the work and get the rights to publish the work, but also, as Anita mentioned, make the PDF available for free for everyone, which I think is a critically important thing that we did. And one of the reasons that we were so enthusiastic to work with them was that willingness to make the PDF available, as well as all of their other books. So go to iskrabooks.org and check out their catalog. I'd like to get into the conversation today. Before we talk about Losurdo's works, we should probably talk about who Losurdo was. I know that several individuals in the chat have talked about how they are very fond of Losurdo's work, but I am sure that not everyone who is listening to this is familiar with Losurdo himself. So I'm going to turn this over to Salvatore at first to talk about who was Domenico Losurdo. Can you give us a brief biographical background on him and maybe focus on his engagement with politics?
Thanks very much, Henry, for this incredible introduction. And Domenico Losurdo was a political philosopher, historian of ideas. Sometimes he would label himself that way, applying historical materialism and dialectical materialism to the development of ideas and ideologies. And you can think about these two volumes that we are focusing on as part of that project. He was a professor of the Università di Urbino in philosophy, but he was also a historian of sorts as well. And certainly that is much of what he devoted his work towards is to look at the historical context of different philosophical movements. The breadth of the philosophical works there and philosophers that he looked at is quite large, focused primarily on European contexts. Although in the latter part of his life, he was certainly becoming much more acquainted with and making more effort towards understanding the Chinese context and the political philosophies coming out of the People's Republic of China. He was also very much involved with communist movements in Italy throughout his life. He was close to the Italian Communist Party until it fell apart, but then continued with Rifondazione Comunista, and then eventually became a member of the refounded Partito Comunista d'Italia, the refounded Italian Communist Party, I think in 2016, 2 years before he perished from a brain tumor that took him away while he was writing extensively on the future of communism, and which is a book that is yet to be translated. He was also very much a contributor to a critique of post-structuralist or post whatever works. Some of these key contributions are there, sort of a critical reevaluation of Nietzsche and Heidegger, as well as really looking much more into Hegel's influences on Marx and Engels, and bringing forth I suppose what became a bit of a controversial understanding of Hegel. I'm not sure whether we'll be able to get into that, but trying to get at some of the problems, historical problems of Marxism, but especially Western Marxism, with respect to dealing with some basics of ontological aspects, anyway, of politics, like some like the contradictions that politics are involved in. So he was in the thick of that kind of discussion, and trying to contribute an understanding of Marxism that would be going away from I'm trying to remember how to translate this into English, but his wording was anima bella, like beautiful spirits, kind of understanding of politics in which people can absorb themselves by basically not being in the thick of the action and not taking power and responsibility that comes with that. So that was part of his efforts, especially in the latter 2 decades of his work. Aside from that, he was the director of a Marxist organization called Marx 21, would be, I guess, the translation. And he was also renowned for his work on Gramsci and interpretations of Gramscian works. And he was also well known as part of one of the several but Marxist-oriented societies that would be focused on Hegel. So he spanned a great deal of different kinds of work. The breadth of work is quite impressive, to say the least, and most of his works, as far as I understand, have not been translated into English yet, but that's something that perhaps we'll be able to discuss later.
Yeah, absolutely. That's something that we're going to pick up on very shortly. So thank you for that, Salvatore. The next topic of discussion, and as I bring up this next topic of discussion, I also want to remind the listeners that if you have specific questions for us, or you would like to follow up on something that is said, you can do so in the Q&A box. We have 23 minutes roughly for Q&A after the interview portion here. So make sure that you're putting those questions in there so that when we get to that time, we can hop right in. The next topic is Domenico Losurdo's thought. So again, if listeners to this program have not already read his work, they may be a little bit confused about what sets Losurdo apart from other thinkers. We understand that he wrote a book on Stalin, but what specifically is this book on Stalin? We know that he has a book on Western Marxism. He has a book on liberalism, which I have next to me on the other side. But what is his thought specifically? So I'm going to ask two questions and direct this towards Gabriel first, but other panelists also feel free to chip in as Gabriel finishes his answer. So what were kind of the influences on Losurdo's thought? Who were some of the thinkers that influenced the way that he analyzed things? And then how did he synthesize these various strands of thought from various thinkers into his mode of analysis that then we can talk about after?
Thank you, Henry. So Losurdo drew widely on the tradition that runs from Marx and Engels through Lenin and up through contemporary both thinkers and activists within the Marxist and broader Leninist tradition. And within that tradition, I think that one of his central methodological contributions has been to position himself as a kind of counter-historian who's working within the imperial core. I think we all know that history is controlled by those who control the means of intellectual production and dissemination, and that the control over history operated by the ruling class is in part an attempt to control the present and the future, and to dictate to people the temporal coordinates of their existence, where they came from, what's going on now, and what's on offer possibly within the future. Losurdo, in being a counter-historian, pushed back very, very strongly against that. And I'd just like to highlight rather quickly some aspects of that counter-historical orientation. One is that Losurdo always situated class struggles in the plural, and hopefully we'll come back to why it is that it's so essential that it's in the plurals, because it doesn't simply mean the struggle between different classes in the economic sense, but it's also struggles between genders, it's a struggle over land, it's a struggle between races and nations, and many more things that we can unpack later. Those class struggles are, of course, they demonstrate that nothing in history is natural. It's the product of those struggles. Secondly, Losurdo always analyzes the social totality, right? So he's not simply doing a fragmentary history or focusing on a particular discipline or a particular area. He is instead situating philosophic and cultural work in relationship to the socioeconomic base and the transformation of that base over time. Thirdly, one of his tactics, which I find particularly interesting and many people I think enjoy in Losurdo, is he demonstrates the profound contradictions that rack bourgeois history, meaning that many of his histories draw explicitly on bourgeois historiography in order to demonstrate that this historiography needs to draw on a factual basis, but they're tasked, bourgeois historians that is, with doing the impossible. That is, making factual reality look like it's not actual reality. And so Losurdo will not only point out those contradictions, but draw on bourgeois historians in order to marshal an argument that is ultimately, obviously, a Marxist argument. The next point that I have is that the social totality for Losurdo is always understood internationally. And the framework of his analysis is drawing, of course, particularly on Lenin and others within that tradition, is he centers the colonial question and he centers the imperial question. So you cannot understand what's going on in the West if you don't understand what's going on with the rest, so to speak. And in fact, it's not only understanding the point of view of those who have been colonized by imperial capitalism, but really centering that as one of the principal driving mechanisms behind the evolution of capitalism. The last thing that I'll say is he understands history as a dialectical process of development. And so any particular event in history needs to be situated in relationship to the general or universal developments within history. And recognizing that history is a process, and I think this is absolutely essential and has, for me, been very informative in regards to my own worldview, we have to understand that socialism itself is a process, and it's a process that he describes very specifically as a process of learning. So socialism, there's no blueprint, doesn't fall from the sky. It's human beings who make it, but they make it by learning from their mistakes and evolving in the direction of greater egalitarianism, sustainability, and other things that I hope we'll be able to discuss on the rest of the call. But I'll turn it back to you, Henry.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that that was a great summary. I want to make sure that I open up the floor to Jennifer and Roderick now, in case either of them would like to contribute to this topic before we move on to the next one. Roderick, I know that you, for example, have written on Twitter as well as elsewhere short summaries of what Losurdo's thought kind of is, in terms of when we're thinking about Losurdo and we're thinking about what his thought means, what kind of modes of analysis are he using? You've done pretty good summaries on that. I know you've mentioned it on several posts on Red Sails. You've done it on Twitter, X.
Yeah, I can. I was going to mention that towards the end, but I can bring it up.
Hop right in, right now.
So I like what Gabriel said about like Losurdo analyzes things in that totality, right? Gabriel also mentioned that Losurdo takes from the traditions with Marx, Lenin, Engels, you know, the Marxist tradition. But I think for Losurdo, it seems to me like one of the big guiding stars is, of course, Hegel. He doesn't only examine Hegel as an object, but he's also like a disciple of Hegel. And so Hegel, what does it mean to analyze something in a totality, right? I think this is best exemplified by his book Liberalism, where in his book Liberalism, he insists that it's almost like his argument is, if you are a cheerleader, yes, that book, Liberalism, A Counterhistory, if you insist on defending the United States as the land of freedom, you're obviously missing the picture, right? Like there's slavery, you know, genocide, settlerism, etc. However, if in indicting the United States, you also eclipse completely the dimension that a lot of people just continuously proclaimed the United States was a land of freedom, right? Like, why? How is it possible? Like, how is it possible that at the same time you have like the proclamation of this is the land of freedom and emancipation and of slavery, right? And Losurdo would refer to this as the tangled paradox of slavery in American liberalism, and and as Gabriel pointed out, not only in America, also in the rest of the world at the time. So yeah, so this drive towards analyzing that totality means not leaving anything behind. It is not sufficient to present your case. You kind of need to present your case, but also account for the case of your adversaries or for your interlocutors or whomever you disagree with. It is not sufficient to say, this is my position. It is important to also explain why somebody else might have the opposite position. And then from that totality, drive your actual conclusion. So yeah, that's what I would add. I think that's about it.
Terrific. Salvatore, I'm going to turn this next question over to you, which is, so we're talking about his mode of analysis now, but we haven't really talked about the topics of focus within his oeuvre. So I'm wondering if you can just take that perhaps in a semi-brief way, because listeners, he has a huge bibliography, particularly in Italian. It's rather limited in English still, but we're working on it. But a huge oeuvre. So I'm wondering, Salvatore, if you can just take a crack at summarizing some of the main topics of his focus and what is available in Italian before we then move on to what's available in English.
All right. And Gabriel and Roderick gave such a fantastic understanding of the life works that I'm basically going to just be listing maybe on some of the topics, which is not going to be an exhaustive list. But I mean, he studied, by the way, under Pasquale Salvucci, who was a senator of the Communist Party of Italy, incidentally. And so just to say that Losurdo was not starting from scratch. I mean, at the university level, you know, already he was developing his methodology with quite a bit of infrastructure in the university where he studied. But he went beyond that, and he developed, I suppose one could say, also a Marxist historiographical method. I think that Gabriel was alluding or stating this before, and I'll just repeat it, you know, that is underpinned by Marxist dialectics and historical materialism. And that included a look at Hegelian philosophy, studies in the histories and philosophy and politics in France and Germany, especially in the 19th century. That was something that he's written about. A critical evaluation of philosophers like Kant, who I didn't mention before, Nietzsche and Heidegger I mentioned earlier, an appraisal of the thought of Lukács. And in fact, I believe that Losurdo was inching closer to the later Lukács in some of his writings, at least from what I recall. Of course, he's written about Lenin's thought, and I mean, he identified as a Marxist-Leninist. I mentioned before he wrote about Gramsci, several works actually, and of course the critiquing the very foundations of liberalism, as already discussed by Gabriel and Roderick. And which is one of the foundational contributions, at least in my view, probably not just. And I mean, he wrote about liberalism in its variegated forms. He wasn't just painting liberalism as some sort of monolithic entity by any means, and also the varieties of capitalist politics that liberalism represents, especially in the context of US history. He was interested, I don't think he really followed through as much in his works, but he was very interested in the history of Black liberation struggles in the US in particular, and also Native American struggles. But also he took pains and to evaluate as well in a manner that's much more constructive than almost any writer from the Western Marxist tradition, if you like, although he doesn't belong to that in some respects. I mean, he broke with that entirely, but he did provide writings about the USSR and the People's Republic of China from a non-revisionist, I mean, an explicitly non-revisionist Marxist-Leninist perspective, and this is part of his main contributions. And I mean, he was also writing critiques of revisionism and of revisionist politics within Western Marxism, and also debunking the concept of totalitarianism along that, and also the other kinds of liberal narratives that are basically anti-socialist, anti-communist in character. He was quite active in doing a lot of critique of that, especially with Arendt and those kinds of writers. And of course, one of the works that we are, I guess, presenting about in some respects is not just an overall critique of Western Marxism that will be forthcoming soon, thanks to Gabriel, Jennifer, and others. But also about the legends surrounding the figure of Stalin, and which also brought up, it was a very controversial book in Italy as well. It continues to be controversial, which hopefully by the end of this session, it will be self-evident that that controversy should not even exist.
Yeah, excellent. So to move on, before we talk about Western Marxism, we'll talk about Western Marxism in one moment. I just want to focus a little bit on what is available in English as of today, because Western Marxism, as Salvatore mentioned, and as we've mentioned several times before, is forthcoming. And I know all of us are very much looking forward to it, Gabriel and Jennifer. So, thank you for doing that work. But there are several works by Losurdo that are available in English. I know I've held up several of them in front of the camera. I mean, I can keep holding up new ones in front of the camera all the time, but there are several works of Losurdo's available in English, and I am aware that we are conversing in English, and therefore everyone who is in the audience is going to be an English speaker, either as a primary or secondary language. And so you would be able to read these works. So I'm going to just open it up for discussion for everyone, actually, for just a moment, to discuss what works are available in English. We can talk about books and we can talk about articles. I know, Roderick, you've done some translation of some articles of his on your website as well, so feel free to bring those up. Just maybe tease what the book is and kind of the central argument within it. I don't want to get too bogged down because I would like to highly recommend the listeners to check out the works themselves. But if we can bring up a few of the works that are available in English and what the central thrust of those arguments presented within those books and articles are, that might be useful for the listeners. So whoever wants to go first, feel free to hop right on in.
I'm happy to start out if you like. One of, I think, his most important books available in English is Class Struggle. And Class Struggle really pushes back very hard against the myth of white male Marxism, this idea that Marxism only has to do with white workers in the imperial core who are like industrial workers. And it completely rejects the idea that Marxism is somehow a European theory that's not germane to struggles elsewhere in the world. And it also rejects the very widespread assumption, I'll use the language of the non-Marxist philosopher Nancy Fraser, to juxtapose struggles for recognition against struggles for redistribution. What Losurdo demonstrates is that class struggles within this broader Marxist tradition that we've been talking about has always been understood in terms of a struggle both for recognition and for redistribution. So you cannot separate the kind of economic struggles from the ideological struggles, if you will. And at the same time, that class struggle is a general genus of which there are many different species. I mentioned this very briefly in passing, but he goes into how there's owners versus workers, how nature as a source of wealth is a site of class struggles, how the struggle between nations in the imperial core and the nations who have been colonized by them is absolutely central to the evolution of capitalism and the understanding of the modern world. And the struggle against domestic slavery as a form of class struggle, as of course people like Engels already pointed out, the struggle between man and woman was the first form of class struggle historically for Engels. So I couldn't recommend that book more strongly.
I just like to recommend an essay of his that I find really useful, and it's called "Has China Turned to Capitalism?" That was published in the International Critical Thought. And I think this is an excellent essay for really assessing the developments of the Chinese Revolution, the continuities between Mao's thought and the reform and opening up. And also it really lays out his critique of populism, which I'm going to be talking about more a little bit later. So I'd highly recommend that essay.
So we've talked about the class struggle book and his commentary on China. Losurdo has the books that I approached Losurdo for initially are you've held up Liberalism and War and Revolution as well, and I think there's also Nonviolence. So these are all very, I would say, explicitly they're very focused with politics and world politics, and it's almost like in the title it's very explicit. What I found surprising is that after kind of enjoying all these books, I decided to look into the more philosophical ones, which is an area that I didn't have that much interest in. Primarily the Heidegger book, the Hegel book, and the Nietzsche book. And initially I was like, well, I'm just going to read them because I'm a fan, you know, like I've enjoyed the other works, so let's check them out. I was actually very surprised, and this was something I was going to mention at the end, but I'm bringing up again a little bit further. It was very surprising to me how much I got out of those books. I think his books on just the philosophical biographies of these thinkers, and there's more, right? There's Kant, it hasn't been translated to English, and Gramsci either. They're off a kind with the other ones. It's surprising. It's surprising that from a book on Nietzsche, I understood so much about the 19th century, but I did, and yeah, I would strongly recommend. I think people should approach the more political or explicitly political works first. But if they like what they're seeing, they should not be at all apprehensive about checking out the other philosophical books. They're much more accessible and much more pertinent than it seems at first sight.
Salvatore, I'll let you answer however you want, but we haven't talked about what the Stalin book is yet. And I know that was one of the impetuses for this event. I know that if people are not familiar with what the book is, they might be thinking maybe it's a biography, maybe it's a history of the Stalin time and government. It's neither of those things, listeners, but I'm sure that you'd rather hear from Salvatore than me. So I'll turn it over to Salvatore. You can talk about that and then anything else in English by Losurdo that you would like to.
Oh, thank you, Henry. But I'm sure you could describe it even better than I can. But I mean, as the title suggests, and this is something that perhaps bears repeating over and over again, it's about the history of, literally, of a legend around the figure of Stalin. It's not really about Stalin per se. In fact, so it's very far from a biography, but it's much more looking critically and through a historical context that varied over time. Is looking at how the figure of Stalin featured in different ways according to different political formations. So it's something that, again, as I was alluding to earlier, it should not be very controversial. I mean, he's tracing basically according to very mainstream writers how the image of Stalin was constructed, and in a contradictory fashion, you know, before, during, and after World War II, and basically, I mean, to put it, I guess, bluntly, showing in the same words of people who are anti-communist how silly their arguments are in so many ways. and also the very problematic ways in which within the communist movement, some parts of the communist movement, Stalin has been constructed in a very simplified fashion, in such a way that it's rather unhelpful politically. So that's really just to be very brief about it. If people are interested in knowing more about the Stalin himself, then that wouldn't be the book to read. However, it would be good to contrast those biographies with the very meticulous work that Losurdo offers in the book with respect to the constructs about Stalin, because oftentimes the biographies of Stalin are vitiated by rather ahistorical understandings of that figure, and also stereotypes that are based on no empirical evidence. So those are things that I guess maybe I would like to add to that. I'm not sure what else could be said about it, since it's Losurdo's work is much broader than having a critical evaluation of the way in which Stalin has been made to be imagined, especially in core capitalist countries like this one, like where I'm sitting in the US, and that. So you could also, the good complement of that book is the liberalism, a counter history, because it really is a good complement to that, and enables one to understand even more clearly what's at stake with different ways in which Stalin is constructed in different decades. So I'm sorry, I'll just leave it there. We could talk longer about the book, but I wouldn't want to take too much time about that.
Of course.
Necessarily. Yeah, thanks.
I know Salvatore and I have done many interviews about the Stalin book already. So instead of us talking too long about that book in particular, we'll just direct the listeners, just Google Stalin History and Critique of a Black Legend. You'll find many interviews that we've done about it already, and more coming out even this week, I believe, on it. So just keep your eyes peeled for that. But I do want to thank Salvatore for bringing up the liberalism book at the same time as the Stalin book. Reason being is that, as I describe the Stalin book, I almost always call it a critical media and narrative analysis. It's not a biography. It's looking at the construction of a narrative and how a narrative can be changed over time, to what ends a narrative changes, the project that the narrative changes are fueling, and what is fueling the impetus for changing those narratives. And the liberalism book does very much the same thing. But instead of looking at the narrative of an individual, it looks at the narrative of a political economic current. And so we hear all of these histories of liberalism, how liberalism has been built over years, and how the philosophical bases on which liberalism stands, and how through iterations we become more and more mature in the liberalism that we're experiencing in the world. What Losurdo does is he really unpacks that and shows that counter history, shows what liberalism is built upon, what liberalism does constitute. And as Roderick mentioned earlier, that constitutes settler colonialism, it constitutes genocide, it constitutes slavery, it constitutes oppression, it constitutes wage slavery. All of these things are constituted and is part of that narrative analysis. So I'm happy that, Salvatore, you mentioned the Stalin book and the liberalism book side by side, because while the topics are very different, I think that that's not all the liberalism book does, but that narrative analysis is something that you see present very firmly in both of those books. And it's important to take those two books side by side for that reason.
If I
Roderick,
may add one thing, I do think it's important to emphasize, though, that one thing for me, I read a bunch of books, but what makes Losurdo special is that he insists to see also, he gives plenty of time for liberals to make their own case. Okay, when he talks about Stalin, you really get to understand not only why some people loved Stalin, but also why some people hated Stalin. And not only in the sense of weaving a narrative, but in the sense of, like, these are the genuine feelings of two sides of a struggle. And in the case of liberalism, he makes very sure that as a reader, you come off not only understanding the counter history, which is the meat of the book, which is like the critique, but he emphasizes the feeling of freedom that is experienced by the liberals at the top of the settler colonial project in America is felt by themselves at the exclusion of what they're doing as a freedom unprecedented, right? So you come away not only understanding the counter history, but also the history, right? Like the textbook history is also very, very accounted for. It's not only a secret story, it's both stories melded together. And I think that's, I think that makes him very, very special, at least in my experience.
Absolutely. I think that that's a critical thing. And just from the perspective of the Stalin book, as I was, along with Salvatore, one of the translators of the work, going through it was crazy because there's over 1,000 in-text citations. And if you look at the references, if I remember the count correctly, it's 346 references in the back of the book. And if you count them, the vast majority are anti-communists and anti-Stalinists, anti-Stalin thinkers, anti-Stalin journalists, anti-Stalin politicians, etc. He allows them to make their case in their own words and then shows what that case is really rooted in. So, Roderick, I think that that was a very important point. I do want to turn to an upcoming book, though, which we've mentioned throughout. Salvatore, I see that you have your hand raised, but we'll hold it for just a second because for timeliness sake, I want to turn over to Western Marxism for a moment. Because as we've mentioned throughout this conversation, Jennifer and Gabriel are undertaking this project of translating Western Marxism into English, and it will be available next year from Monthly Review Press, and we're all incredibly excited for it. So, Jennifer, why don't I turn it over to you first? Can you talk about Western Marxism and the fundamental argument within that book, just as a teaser for the listeners so that they know what they're going to be able to get next year when it comes out?
Yes, wonderful. Thank you. So the book is coming out. Gabriel edited it. This translation was done by Stephen Colatrella, and in addition to including a long introduction by Gabriel and myself, the book also includes the first English translation of an important lecture Losurdo presented on this topic of Western Marxism in 2007. So the book basically elucidates one of the major splits in global Marxist debates between what Losurdo and others refer to as Eastern and Western Marxism. And it's a rejoinder to Perry Anderson's Trotskyist assessment of this split. So rather than referring to geography, Eastern and Western Marxism refer to two different political orientations which have manifested themselves across the globe. Eastern Marxism refers to those who identify with socialist projects that have actually exercised power, such as in Cuba, the USSR, Vietnam, Korea, so forth. Western Marxists, by contrast, describes intellectuals who reject these real-world efforts to construct socialism in favor of intellectual practice, essentially. Some even present their distance from power as a kind of epistemological advantage to discover some kind of more authentic Marxism. So, thus, while Eastern Marxism is dedicated to the difficult and drawn-out process of building socialism in a capitalism-dominated world, Western Marxists often belittle concrete struggles against imperialism because these do not live up to these intellectuals' imagined standards of intellectual or theoretical purity. So Losurdo's critique really focuses on philosophical currents coming out of the Frankfurt School and French theory, as well as other thinkers that are proximate to these traditions, like Michael Hart, Mario Tronti, Hannah Arendt, and Slavoj Žižek. And it's important to know that he's not offering a kind of ad hominem attack that goes after these thinkers for their individual ideas. As in all of his work, Losurdo elucidates the objective social forces that have produced Western Marxism as a remarkably consistent ideology in imperialist countries, as well as among class strata in the periphery that aspire to kind of the rewards of the empire, right? So, to elucidate the material basis of Western Marxism, Losurdo is really drawing a lot on Lenin's lapidary indictment of chauvinism in the socialist movement within imperialist states. And, many of Lenin's really searing critiques of revisionism, which means, refers to the gutting of Marxism's revolutionary core, really center on a condemnation of the social chauvinism that plagued the European members of the Second International. And what's important is Lenin identifies the material basis of this chauvinism. And he argues that the imperialist extraction of monopolist super profits from peripheral societies basically created a labor aristocracy among the European working class, resulting in their embourgeoisement, meaning their identification with the interests of their own national bourgeoisies over and against their fellow proletarians in other countries. So likewise, Losurdo is really demonstrating how many Western Marxists' chauvinism, is similarly based in the political economy of imperialism, and and he shows how it expresses itself in paternalistic attitudes towards the efforts of workers and peasants in the peripheries to struggle against imperialism. And he identifies, I just want to talk about some of the main features that he identifies across the various thinkers who he examines. One is the very classic idea that this kind of chauvinism is so embedded that Western Marxists can, dismiss socialism, any efforts to build socialism around the world without even actually studying any of these movements in any serious manner. Losurdo also identifies populism, which I mentioned earlier, as a really key feature of Western Marxism. And this is a really important critique that he did, elaborates in his work, that he's also drawing on Lenin's critiques of populism. And this is basically a kind of disposition that wants to celebrate the moral excellence of those who are oppressed and bereft of power, without actually scientifically identifying the material forces that cause that oppression or a way to struggle against it. And so it's this type of populism often leads intellectuals to side with the oppressed only as long as they are losing, not if they actually manage to, successfully gain state power. And this is something that, Losurdo really, he critiques and shows the kind of irony of this, that basically, and he relates this to kind of Hegel's criticism of a disposition in Christians who, in order to, accomplish their obligation to serve the poor, actually need poverty to persist indefinitely. So this kind of populism that Losurdo identifies, he sees it among intellectuals who are opposed to political parties, who are opposed to the exercise of state power, because these ideas about getting organized through the party form might inexorably lead to new forms of oppression that would besmirch the moral excellence of the downtrodden. And this is another reason why rebellionism is another leitmotif that he identifies. And this is a kind of tendency for intellectuals to sort of celebrate insurgency and revolt for their own sake, without close attention to the context or concrete political content of that rebellionism. And so you see Western Marxists just kind of exalt this sort of figure in revolt, which is often a kind of projection of their own self-image. And this is something that, Losurdo draws on really important important insights from Gramsci, when he explains that this kind of rebellionism can lend itself to very distinct political projects. And as we know, the deep and expansive history of dissident politics should have clearly demonstrated to us at this point that this is the case, since we know that the US state often, promotes right-wing and even philo-fascist dissident projects. And finally, I wanted to note that the other tendency that, Losurdo identifies is this kind of utopianism and a kind of trafficking in magical thinking if there is any concern with proposing an alternative to the extant order. And one of the things I find really useful is Losurdo shows how this kind of messianism reflects the influence of Judeo-Christian ideologies on many Western Marxists. And though this messianism takes a lot of different forms, it basically expresses itself in a kind of tendency to project a vision of a socialist future that is completely other than what totally exists, as if it didn't have to actually be created out of what exists, right? And this idea, this future that is projected as completely other, therefore cannot somehow be arrived at through the telluric path of extant institutions, including the role of law, parliament, parties, states, and so forth. It's supposed to somehow arrive more or less miraculously. So, and I just want to say, a lot of what Losurdo diagnoses is really applies to a lot of other contemporary trends in critical theory, not only the schools I mentioned. I mean, I'm thinking of decolonial theory, post-colonial theory, Afro-pessimism, subaltern studies, and so forth. And finally, I just want to note that, more than a critique, this book is also really a call to intellectuals to develop the rich tradition of critical communism, which means learning from the practical lessons of the global history of class struggle, rather than trying to seek refuge in a realm of ideas or purported theoretical blueprints.
Yeah, terrific. Thanks for that overview, Jennifer. Gabriel, I hate to do this to you, but I can only give you 2 minutes to add anything that you would like to on Western Marxism.
Jennifer covered absolutely everything, so let's keep moving on.
Terrific. Appreciate that for the sake of time. And Jennifer, again, I really appreciate that overview. It was tremendous. So I want to move on. I guess before I move on, I'll just mention that there are a lot of other Losurdo works that are available in Italian, which are not available in English yet. That hopefully will change soon. I know Salvatore and I are trying to get the rights to some more of Losurdo's works to also translate via our publisher Iskra. Salvatore and I have another book that's coming out at Iskra next year, but it's not Losurdo, so we'll talk about it later. But there are other works that can be translated. So listeners, what something I would recommend you to do is contact some publishers and recommend them to look at translating Losurdo as well, because there is a huge catalog of his works, which some of your favorite publishers should absolutely be looking at. But until they do, we will continue to do that ourselves. So moving on, I want to talk a little bit about the relevance of Losurdo outside of academia, because I understand, and the listeners will probably see, Jennifer, Salvatore, and Gabriel, you're all academics. Roderick and I are not, but most of this conversation has been very academic in focus. It has been talking about how Losurdo's thought furthers various academic disciplines in various academic fields. But of course, we cannot confine our thought to the academy. The point is to take that thought that is in some cases developed within the academy, but then take it out of the academy and apply it into the real world. And that's going to be the focus of our next topic, which is the relevance of Losurdo outside of the academy. I am going to stick with our academics to begin with, though. So Gabriel, Jennifer, Salvatore, I'll start with Gabriel. How can scholar activists make use of Losurdo's work outside of that academic context?
Well, Losurdo, and I think the same goes for the 3 quote-unquote academics that you just listed on the call, was a lifelong activist, and so did not accept the ivory tower notion that bourgeois ideology imposes on all of us, meaning that, wherever you make your work is where you live, and that's it. And in that regard, Losurdo's own intellectual work, I think, made an enormous contribution to providing what I would refer to as a kind of cartography of global class struggle. When you're in a war, because there is an international class struggle going on, then you need people doing different tasks. And one very important one is mapping the very nature of that struggle. And I'll just point to one conceptual intervention that I think is very important that Losurdo made and speaks volumes to the nature of the struggle that's currently going on, and also echoes some of Anita's very important points that she made in the opening of the call concerning the settler colonial project that's ongoing in Gaza. And that is that Losurdo diagnosed the history of totalitarianism as a concept, and he demonstrated that it was originally developed by communists to describe life under capitalism, because under capitalism, you depend for your means of survival on a whole series of relationships that basically have to do with the wage relation as the means of survival. In that regard, the ideological conception of totalitarianism that was developed later by people like Hannah Arendt and members of the national security state in the United States is a recuperation of the communist understanding of totalitarianism, but it tries to do the impossible. And that is a not so sophisticated version of horseshoe theory in which it demonstrates that fascism and communism are somehow the same. Losurdo theorized this in terms of a distinction between naturalistic despecification. Despecification is the process by which a particular group or body politic despecifies other groups, meaning it rejects them and excludes them from the group. Naturalistic Sorry, my mute just went on. We're good? So naturalistic despecification is a process by which certain groups are excluded from the community based on quote unquote natural properties, right? These properties can be ethnic, they can be racial, they can be gender, they can be religious, etc. This is the kind of core and essence of the history of racializing processes, and it is integral to the history of fascism. And we see it operative today in the way in which the Palestinians are referred to as human animals who must be eliminated by many members of the Israeli government. Against that, he juxtaposes what he calls moral political despecification. And that is the form of despecification operative in the history of the communist movement. When in moments of crisis, certain members of the community either need to be excluded or banned in various ways, the reason for doing that is not because of a natural attribute that they purportedly have, it's because of their political and moral decisions, right? So when Stalin was waging war against the Nazi war machine, he was very clear that it was a war not against the German people. We don't hate them as a people. We're not going to destroy them as a people. It's a war against the capitalist ruling class and the way in which they've used fascism in Germany as a weapon of war against the global socialist movement. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to turn it over to Salvatore and then Jennifer in turn. Feel free to go right after each other, but do try to keep it brief. I know that is very difficult, but we are running a bit short on time at this point.
Just I would stress the part, I guess, really to build off of Gabriel. Really, it's the ideological struggle. Losurdo is, I think, if you read at least some of the works that we've mentioned, including the work on the image of Stalin and counter history of liberalism, for example, it's good. You can learn from it in terms of how to take apart a whole bunch of narratives in their own terms and turn them against themselves. So I think that's very useful as part of an ideological struggle that also has to be parallel with struggles on the streets and everywhere else. So I'll leave it at that.
I don't need to add anything else on this question. I know we're short on time.
Okay, I appreciate that. And I also, echo everyone that has talked so far. I do want to turn it over to Roderick, though, because Roderick, you and I are the two on the panel that are outside of academia. So what can readers
I'll try to keep it very brief. I've already talked most of the points that I have brought up. Okay, so Losurdo, in his polemic with Jean-Jacques Marie, Trotskyist from France, he highlights two parts of his analysis that I think are very important. Okay, what is the use of Losurdo for like a regular working Slack, like a regular person, not even an activist, just like a regular person? I think the content of the books is very important, but I think very important also is the way he argues differently, as I've highlighted many times. Two things that Losurdo highlights is is his use of comparatistics. Comparatistics is something that we would today call whatabout. Many people would accuse of whataboutism. You're trying to understand China. You say, oh, but whatever. People, but the United States has prisons too, whatever. People are like, oh, that's whataboutism. This is a way in which people are more or less disciplined into not being able to approach a topic. It's like a little bit like being told this is out of your pay grade. Like you should just stay out of it. You don't ask too many questions. And the other thing he focuses on, he defends comparatistics. And I think he defends the right of people to explore a topic by asking whataboutism type questions. And the other thing he rejects is, and he indicts not only anti-Stalinists, but also Stalin himself, for engaging in the narrative of betrayal. That means that when you're trying to understand something, you're trying to understand, not in this context, it's like, the Stalin period of the USSR. And everyone is accusing each other of being a backstabber. It's like Trotsky backstabbed Stalin, and Stalin backstabbed Trotsky, and the working class was backstabbed, and then Khrushchev came and backstabbed people, and then China came and there was backstabbing, and so this is all just like backstabbing and backstabbing and backstabbing. And Losurdo says, you're not going to get anywhere like this. You need to actually analyze the objective contradictions that led to these outcomes and why people are launching these accusations, and try to give him the credit, try to give Trotsky the credit for trying to do his best. And Stalin was also trying to do his best. But even though they were both trying to do his best, there were still problems. Just trying is not enough, right? And so in doing this, Losurdo, in teaching people, hey, you should do more whataboutism and you should not do narratives of betrayal, Losurdo is teaching people to think better. And I think this is something that he takes from Hegel. Hegel wanted to do popular philosophy. People laugh about it because he's so considered impenetrable these days, but he was trying to do popular philosophy. And Lenin was also like, we need to teach people to think. Philosophy is a useful tool for the working class. And Gramsci, of course, great educator. And all of these are, and Marx and Engels as well. So all these are huge influences in Losurdo. And I think Losurdo really not only is trying to teach the content of his books, but he's also trying to be a role model for people on how you can think about these questions and not get trapped in like a dead end, in like a ditch, just not being able to ask any more questions, or becoming a very eccentric person that can no longer talk to liberals because I think very different than you do. Losurdo could do that. Losurdo could talk to a liberal, no problem. He understands how they think. So I think, yeah, in doing this, I think Losurdo basically teaches philosophy to any reader, and correctly and pertinently. And I think it's useful even if you're not an academic. It's just useful to approach the world.
Yeah, terrific. We have one question left, and I have enough time built in for 1 minute for each of you. So just like a presidential debate, you get your closing statement, and it'll be the same statement for everyone. And I'm just going to read off the list of people in order that I see them to answer this question. So Jennifer, Salvatore, Roderick, Gabriel. The question is, what does Losurdo mean to you?
I'll just say that what I just said before, I think it goes. I think he's talking about something better.
Great. Jennifer, you're up.
I just wanted to say one of the things that I really helped me is understand the importance of development and as key to the struggle against neocolonialism. And I think that he, really clarifies that the struggle for sovereignty for people who've historically been subject to colonialism and imperialist depredation is necessarily tied to the struggle for development, and that is profoundly underappreciated by people in the overdeveloped imperialist core. And so he really gives us this question for the Western left that asks, are the unfulfilled promises of the anti-colonial revolution a sufficient reason to align ourselves with the neo-colonial counter-revolution? And he emphasizes that that's the question that really faced us in the West.
For me, among other things, Losurdo is a model of what to do in terms of intellectuals of any sort intervening in politics and in discussions, everyday discussions as well, in terms of understanding one's role, understanding the context in which one is speaking, one is writing, and how important that is, so that one can help avoid, or at least contribute to avoiding the kinds of construction of ideas that actually run counter to any sort of socialist revolutionary potential, if you will. That is what one of the main things that I get from reading Losurdo, is really understanding one's historical context and acting accordingly and in a responsible way.
Gabriel.
I think that Losurdo gives us a nuanced understanding of the dialectics of socialism, in the sense that socialism is a very difficult project of development, particularly because of the imperialist siege that has been imposed upon socialism, and that he presents us, and this here I'll echo Jennifer, with a very stark choice, and that is, do we want to be on the side of the difficult project and the process of learning that's referred to as socialism, or do we want to be on the side of those who accommodate capitalism because they withdraw in horror as soon as they see how difficult it is for socialism to develop in the real world, as opposed to in the ethereal mind of those who presume to know?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would like to echo everyone and just add in briefly on behalf of myself that Losurdo is a really great example of someone who is absolutely uncompromising in their analysis, is willing to delve into the topics that generate controversy, is willing to go out and be an activist on top of doing that scholarship on controversial topics, and to not back down when being challenged by unprincipled critiques, which we have seen many of Losurdo, and he has been public in debates with individuals who have taken, in some cases, scholarly debate against him, and in some cases, outright slander against him, and has shown that no, It is an ideological disagreement, and we are uncompromising in our ideological standing and our ideological position. This is really inspiring to me, to see that you can have somebody who is a renowned philosopher. I know our friend Emmanuel Ness calls him the greatest philosopher of the later 20th and early 21st century. I think that that's in many cases true. But we see that despite being this, highly revered figure in many circles, he is still willing to get into those controversial topics that he knows are going to get mud thrown on his name, and in some cases at him personally, and still do it in an uncompromising and principled way, full of scholarly rigor and full of activist fervor. So on that note, then, we're going to close out this interview portion. I'd like to thank the panelists for answering the questions that I had posed, but now we're going to open up the listener Q&A portion of this discussion. Like I said earlier, if you have a question that you would like to ask to the panelists today, you can type it into the Q&A, which is on the side of your screen right now. We do have some very good questions already, and so what I will do is I will read some of them and have my panelists take them. We have quite a few, so panelists, I am going to ask you to try to be brief in answering some of these excellent questions, because we do have only about 22 minutes before we have to close out. So the first question that we have is from Nia, who asks a very good question, and I see Roderick smiling because we both know who Nia is. This is a very good question, and is almost the inverse of the question that we closed out with, which is what do each of you disagree with Losurdo about?
So I've discussed it with Nia before. I really like Losurdo, so it's often like, well, what do you not like about him? I find it hard to say not like, because I think even disagreement, or ostensible disagreement, I enjoy but anyway, Losurdo very much defends nationalism. I think he defends nationalism as a real, actual historical force. I, as a person, do not have strong national links to any nation. I'm Latin American. I live in Canada. My family hails from Europe. For me, fully agreeing with Losurdo about the absolute primacy of nationalism in the struggle for liberation leaves me a little bit adrift, because I don't know exactly, does that mean that I can't really contribute, or does it mean that my contribution will always have to be auxiliary? I haven't fully resolved what is my relationship to that thesis of Losurdo. I think it's a strong thesis. I think he backs it very well. He says that all revolutionary movements have been led by communists, like many successful revolutionary movements have been led by communists, but no revolutionary movement has been successful without grounding itself in national soil. Right? Something like that. And so the question of nationalism, I think he defends it very well. And I don't fully know what my relationship to it is. It's not necessarily a disagreement. It's just like it's an open question. Like, where do I stand in relationship to that thesis? As a cosmopolitan person, so to speak. So yeah, that's for me the question that I grapple with.
Perhaps I can say something to that. For me to be even able to disagree with Losurdo would necessitate a much greater depth of understanding of Hegel, for example, and of other kinds of philosophers. And so for me, it's difficult to find disagreement because I don't feel like I have the instruments to necessarily disagree. I am perplexed about his reading of Hegel in a particular way, like in terms of thinking that there is an idealistic or historical idealism current within Marxism from the outset, and that may be true, but I need to investigate that further. And I have not read all of Losurdo's books, so it might not be a disagreement. It might be something that I just need to explore and see whether I really disagree with it or not.
Gabriel, Jennifer, either of you want to chime in, or should we move to the next question?
I'm fine with moving to the next. Jen?
Yeah, I'm fine with moving on.
Okay, great. I'm going to move to the question that is posed by Bradley. Another excellent question. And again, listeners, you can ask questions in the Q&A section. Bradley asks, especially with what you've shared about Losurdo's background, the Gramscian notion of common sense comes to mind as an ongoing challenge. How would you approach a discussion encouraging someone with the hegemonic narrative, bourgeois historiography at hand to give this kind of book a chance? And I believe by this book, they're referring to the Stalin book, but it also could be with reference to Western Marxism, absolutely.
I could say, go ahead, Roderick.
You should go. I already went before. I can add to yours.
Okay. I'll be quick. I think that Losurdo and his book on Gramsci is excellent in that regard. Really does draw on the distinction that Gramsci makes between common sense and good sense, and the ways in which common sense often does have certain truths kind of encased within it, but they tend to contradict other truths. And so part of the process of cultivating what Gramsci calls good sense is subjecting what you've learned from common sense, meaning the things that you've inherited, the worldviews that you've inherited, to critical analysis, self-reflection, the scientific method. And so one of the strengths of Losurdo's kind of pedagogical undertaking is that he often begins with kind of debates where they're at, and then moves people slowly through them. And so even someone who would be hostile to communism or socialism or Marxist analysis could very well read just about any one of his books, because he provides so much data that is actually from the common sense canon, meaning the canon of bourgeois history, of bourgeois thinkers, etc. And he walks you through them and shows what is coherent, what is not coherent, and I think therefore makes very compelling arguments and is not necessarily just preaching to the choir by any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah, I basically was going to say something very similar, which is that Losurdo is speaking from within the hegemonic narrative a little bit. Like, as was pointed out by you, Henry, I think, like the amount of citations he draws from standard sources. He's citing Simon Sebag Montefiore. He's citing Robert Service. He's citing, like, familiar names. He's not citing some obscure, like, he's not only citing Molotov. In fact, he rarely cites Molotov. He will cite them. So this means that Losurdo is trying to reach the reader where they're at, most likely. They are not trying to come in as a huge, like, with a completely no. It's like, agree with me and also trust me with all my own private sources that you've never heard before. He is building off of what is already there, and I think in general that's the strength of Losurdo's work. It's he's reaching people where they're at. And to add, like, one, I understood the question also as asking, what could a person today possibly have to, why would you spend 350 to 400 pages of learning about Stalin? Like, what's the point? That was a long time ago. I think Losurdo makes the point in the book, and I think someone who's read the book should be able to kind of sell the idea or the argument that Stalin and Trotsky aren't just people that existed once upon a time. They represented tendencies. Like, he talks about Trotsky as representing the tradition of charismatic power, and as Stalin as representing the tradition of legal, the name is escaping me, but like legal authority, right? Like, Trotsky represents charisma, Stalin represents kind of like stodginess in a way, okay? And even if Trotsky and Stalin are gone, those tendencies to latch onto charisma and to latch onto tradition are still here with us. So if you understand the conflicts well, then if you feel like these conflicts are still relevant, this old dispute between, the Stalin era is still very relevant today. And I think someone who's, that's making the book relevant to people today is one way in which you can tell people, this is worth your time, even though it seems arcane.
Can I just very briefly, if there's time, just to ground it in at least the book on the image of Stalin, just to follow through for what Gabriel and Roderick already said. Just pointing out perhaps sometimes what is common sense in the 1940s, that Stalin was Time Person of the Year, and then shortly thereafter Stalin is equated to Hitler, should already create a little bit of disjuncture in the minds of many people. Just maybe doing that, and Losurdo of course goes into much greater detail beyond that, but I think that's part of the work that needs to be done. And he shows the way forward.
I'm going to ask the next question, unless Jennifer, do you have something that you want to add here? Okay, next question. But before I do, I just want to mention, since Roderick brought up citing Molotov versus citing Montefiore, I just looked through the Stalin book very quickly. There's a grand total of 0 citations of Molotov in it, and he cites Montefiore in no less than 7 different points throughout the book. So, that just speaks to what Roderick was saying, and is a kind of a funny aside. The next question, I think I'm going to direct it towards you first, Salvatore, because I know this is something that you have talked with me a little bit about. It's a question from Hakan, which was, what was Losurdo's stance on the PRC, that's People's Republic of China, and did it evolve in the last decade before his death? Did he / the new PCI maintain contacts with the CPC? And I know, Roderick, you've also written things on Losurdo and China on Red Sails as well. So the two of you are probably who I'm going to send this over to first.
Roderick will probably know much more than I should suspect. And Jennifer already pointed out the article in the International Critical Thought that actually well represents how Losurdo was, in what direction Losurdo was moving politically. I'm not sure. I think he went to the People's Republic of China at some point, and I think he even met with Ronald Boer, who's an excellent scholar on politics and philosophies within the Communist Party of China and beyond that. So he was already making moves like a couple of decades, possibly like by the late 90s, but I can't recall. But the stance on the People's Republic of China was generally an understanding stance, and not one that was prone to quick and rough judgments, but trying to grasp what the long-term view should be about the People's Republic of China. That's sort of my understanding of it, and really actually spelling out how critiques of the People's Republic of China, which really critiques of the Communist Party of China, are ill-founded for the most part, and in fact, again, going back to what Gabriel, Jennifer, and Roderick have already stated, to demonstrate this kind of this tendency of those who refuse to take any responsibility for any power or anything that goes wrong whenever you have a revolutionary movement, compared to those who actually are in the revolutionary movement, are actually accomplishing things, which is to say the Communist Party of China have been accomplishing a great many things. And this, I think that's where he would stand about the People's Republic of China. Did he... with the new Communist Party of Italy, he became part of it. He joined it in 2016. I'm not sure how much detail I should go into that, because
I think we should move on because we're very short on time.
Do you want me to add to that very briefly?
If you have something, also Jennifer, I know that you cited that article earlier, so you might have something here as well. But let's yes, add to it, but try to be brief.
Yeah, very briefly. I linked to Domenico Losurdo in China, an insight to the state of Marxist education and the CPC by Roland Boer. He's written about this. Roland Boer, also on the occasion of Losurdo's passing, wrote I can't find a link to it, but people can reach out to me for it. He wrote a nice little memoir, kind of him traveling by train with Losurdo in China. And Losurdo's feelings about China were very positive. Like, he defends China as a socialist project. In an interview with Boitempo TV in Brazil, I would have to find a link, but he actually goes really far out. He calls Deng Xiaoping one of the greatest communist leaders of the 20th century, and he says that it's not fair to only judge the leaders by the winning over power, like the struggle for power in the revolution, but you also have to give credit to the leaders that are mostly successful in construction. Revolution is at least a two-sided process, winning power, yes, but also constructing a new regime. And I think he gives a lot of credit to Deng Xiaoping. And so he's very positive on Deng Xiaoping. He really was very positive and optimistic about China. He thought they were making trade-offs, that we all understand their trade-offs. It's not like a panacea. He never liked that. He said that socialism is a difficult learning construction process. So yeah, very positive on China, and I really recommend those who are curious to check out the article that Jennifer recommended, but also the memoir that Boer wrote is very, very sweet, and I really like it.
Jennifer, anything to add quickly here?
You can go on to the next
Okay,
question.
great. So there's a couple of really big questions, and I am trying to figure out what ones we'll have time for, because that's always the threat at the end. But since we did mention Heidegger a few points during this this interview, perhaps we can be brief on this answer. I think that it will be possible here. Amir asks, What were Losurdo's view on Martin Heidegger? Did he consider him an important philosopher and defend his Nazi past? I think we can be brief with that, but whoever wants to take it, go ahead.
I can take it, but I'm the least academic here. So if anyone else wants to go, probably.
There's nothing wrong with being a non-academic, Roger. Go ahead.
I'm just saying. Losurdo defended. Okay, Losurdo has a tactic that he uses for Nietzsche and Heidegger both, and he compares them as like peas in a pod a little bit. He thinks that a lot of people, in defending Heidegger and Nietzsche as not that reactionary, they actually downplay their intellectual contributions. So Losurdo is politically completely opposed to Nietzsche and Heidegger. But as an intellectual, he thinks that they were mounting a strong defense for reaction. And so, for instance, when Heidegger's black books came out, which were like a scandal, like, oh, turns out Heidegger really was a Nazi. He was really, really a Nazi. He's not like, oh, an opportunism, like an accident. No, Heidegger was committed to the project. And so the black books came out, and a lot of the defenders of Heidegger had to kind of like reckon with them. And Losurdo wrote a piece for The Guardian called "The Black Books Weren't Surprising." Like, if you were paying attention, if you were taking Heidegger seriously as a thinker with his like anti-modernism and his like destruction of like opposition to reason and stuff like that, you would understand that, yeah, there was a real kinship there between him and the Nazis. And this should be, yeah, he was a philosophical champion for the Nazis for a reason. So he's at the same time, I would say, damning him politically as like partisan of a bad project, but he's rescuing him intellectually as like a talented philosopher. So that's how I understand. The book on Heidegger is hard to come by. It was translated by John and Marella Morris, but it's fantastic. I really recommend it if you are at all curious about Losurdo on Heidegger.
Any other brief comments on this, or shall we move on? Okay. This is from Ray. Going back to the points on populism, can you talk about Losurdo's position that Marxism itself does not lionize poverty, but many of the movements that have seized power in the name of Marxism have done so? Can you talk about the key differences between this view and a more populist view? Now, this is a very interesting question and could be a very big one, but again, we are running short on time, so try to rein it in.
So this is something that he addresses really directly in that article that I mentioned, where, and he's, just to give you, he quotes, for example, Deng and saying that unless you are developing the productive forces and raising people's living standards, you cannot say you are building socialism. So he really, critiques a kind of idea that socialism would be about the equal distribution of poverty. And he really argues for the importance of developing the productive forces. And this kind of goes, and again, and just to go back to what I talked about earlier, that this is both necessary to meet the needs of people who have been subject to imperialism, dependency, and unequal development, but also that this struggle for developing the productive forces is really necessary to avoid the imperialist subordination, and becoming once again a semi-colonial or neo-colonial subordinate to imperial powers.
Okay, I'll move on to the next question then. Another very useful question for people who are reading Losurdo and are looking for something similar. What communist historians that write in English, or at least have translations in English, I would add, have work comparable to Losurdo? Did he ever recommend any? This is from Tony.
A few quick ones that come to mind: Walter Rodney, Ludo Martins, Michael Parenti, of course. I'm sure there are others that I'm forgetting, but that's a quick, they're definitely in the same zone and way of thinking. I'm sure others will have other ideas.
Gerald Horne, absolutely read all of his works.
He's cited in Losurdo as well, I will add.
Yeah, I would say all these thinkers, again, you mentioned Walter Rodney, Michael Parenti, Gerald Horne. Who else did you mention? I endorse all of these. These are all great. I would say that none of them are quite like Losurdo in the philosophical twist to the whole thing, but they are, maybe Rodney comes closest, maybe? I don't know. But yeah, there are a lot, like, we could even depart a little bit further out. For example, Nia, my co-editor at Red Sails, has written a very nice piece called Losurdo and Roberts. William Roberts is a very different kind of thinker. He's an Anglo-analytical kind of basis and stuff like that. but he's an out. I don't know. There's some points of similarity. William Clare Roberts and Losurdo. We tend to think there's some interesting similarities there. And I also really like a thinker from China that there's been an effort to try to make him controversial in the West because he translated Schmidt for the Chinese context. But Jiang Shigong also has this like sprawling historical narrative when he explains imperialism, and he tries to really get to the roots. Like, why was Europe so kind of like exploratory? Why when Europe touched Africa, it led to colonization, whereas when China went to Africa, it led to trade or whatever. It's a Chinese perspective, but nothing wrong with that. And he's also very materialist, I think, in his explanations. So yeah, I would add William Clare Roberts and Jiang Shigong to the list.
Jennifer, anything spring to mind? Great. Then I'm going to kind of combine two questions here. It's going to be the last thing that we have time for. We've got 1 or 2 minutes left. So again, brief is the operative word here. So Ian asked about the Stalin book and why it's controversial. I think that can be extended to Losurdo more generally. And then also one of the other questions I had, which I will try to find here, was asking about why are some of these things that Losurdo was analyzing relevant today still? Like, why is looking at Stalin relevant today, or why is looking at the Trotskyist critique of Stalin relevant today when Stalin and Trotsky are both long dead? So these two questions about why there is this controversy around Losurdo and around this book in particular, but more generally as well, and why are some of these topics that Losurdo is talking about, which may be divorced quite some time temporally from today, why are they still relevant to today's questions and today's struggles?
I can just jump in. I think on the relevance question, Losurdo really, one of the things that I appreciate so much about his work is his attention to imperialism as a central contradiction of class struggle, and really also he really historicizes our contemporary moment as one in the kind of onslaught of neocolonialism, generally US-led neocolonialism, US-led imperialism. That is absolutely relevant to everything that is going on. And, just as Anita's opening remarks referenced, we're really looking at the, barbarity of imperialism around the world, including in Palestine. And so I think, Losurdo's perspective is absolutely essential for understanding, imperialism's centrality to contemporary history and geopolitics.
Perhaps, in Italy, that work in particular of Stalin was controversial, but only because there were some segments of the left that like to continue with this trope of using Stalin to batter, another part of the left. I think that's to a large extent what goes on about this, and it's just sometimes just knee-jerk reaction. It has very little to do with the content of the book, which is really sad, and it's very, very much shown in the way that sometimes that book had been received, at least in Italy. I don't know about in the US, but it seems that it's going to be similar. Just you mentioned Stalin, immediately, you get this knee-jerk, sort of reaction, either anti-communist one, or you're painted as a Stalinist just by writing about Stalin, or not even about Stalin in the case of Losurdo, but about the image constructed around Stalin.
Yeah. I think absolutely. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but I do want to thank everyone for being part of this panel. I will recommend this book until you actually open this book, so do pick up the Stalin History and Critique of a Black Legend book. You can get it from iskrabooks.org, either as paperback, hardcover, or download the PDF for free. Again, that was very important to us. Thanks again, everyone. I'm just going to have you tell the listeners how they can find you or your other work, if you have anywhere to direct them to, or any of your other works that you would like to direct them to. So Jennifer, where would the listeners look if they wanted to find more of your work? You are muted. Okay, Gabriel, we'll turn it over to you.
I can put my website in the chat if people want to check it out.
Okay, absolutely. Roderick?
The main place is, of course, redsales.org. It's just like a collection of essays. You can also email us, and I'm mostly active on Twitter. That's by far the easiest way to reach me at Roderick Day, just as my name is here, altogether.
Terrific.
And thank you for having
Salvatore? Of course.
For me, the easiest route is just to look at my institutional website, which is at State University of New York at New Paltz in New York State, and there you'll see my email address. And if any of the works that I have listed on the website is of interest, I'm more than happy to share. So thank you.
Absolutely. As for me, listeners, you can find me on Twitter at Huck1995, HUCK1995, and you can follow the show that I co-host, Guerrilla History, with Guerrilla being spelled GUERRILLA History, wherever you get your podcasts. And that's also on Twitter at Guerrilla_pod. Again, GUERRILLA_pod. Thank you again, Anita, and I will turn it back over to you to close us out.
Well, we haven't heard from Jennifer, so.
Oh, sorry. I just
Yeah.
put my link in the chat, and also I just to check out the critical theory workshop that Gabriel and I direct.
Thank you. Thank you to Henry, Salvatore, Gabriel, Jennifer, and Roderick for this beautiful and stirring tribute to Domenico Losurdo. As mentioned in the chat, this recording will be available at this link, so please share it with your comrades. We hope to see you all again soon, either virtually or in person. I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day. Take care.
Thank you all.